Are we there yet? So when I was a kid, my dad died. I grew up in Baltimore when I was a little kid, and my mom remarried. And my stepdad is a Lutheran school teacher and a minister of music, and decided to take a call to Edina, Minnesota, between my sophomore and junior year in high school. Perfect timing for a kid. So all the people that I knew, all the things I grew up with, all my friends were there in Baltimore. And I remember that long drive from Baltimore to Minneapolis seemed to take forever. About halfway across Wisconsin, so man, are we there yet? And every parent knows this word from the back seat. So when kids, any kind of trip, are we there yet? So that's my question. Are we there yet? And today we're going to talk about this thread that weaves through the Old Testament story and gets us to heaven, this thread of the promised land. And the question is, are we there yet? Have we reached the promised land? I'm going to try and answer that question together this morning. So back in 2019, on my sabbatical, I actually got to go there to the promised land. And this first picture, go ahead and throw it there. On the top left, this is actually Mount Nebo, where Moses goes, and the people are going to enter the promised land. There's actually the church there on the top on the left. That's the top of Mount Nebo. And for me, it was like this emotional and powerful moment to be in this place on planet Earth, standing where Moses stood. And all the Bible stories begin to come true when you're sort of imagining being in the place. And you can literally stand on the top of that mountain, look across the Jordan River, and see the promised land. Next picture. And there at the top of that spot, probably about where Moses stood, is this cross. And at the bottom of the cross, it's a sculpture that says, just as Moses was lifted up in the desert, just as Moses lifted up a serpent in the desert, the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. Now, I love how artists have this creative way of creating those moments and connections in a spot. So I'm staying in this spot, imagining Moses being there and thinking about the story of Jesus. For God so loved the world is the next verse to that verse on the cross. And it's in that moment that we realize the promised land and all these stories, they find their way of pointing us to Jesus. Next slide. So this is if you're standing in front of that cross or looking across the valley into the promised land. And imagine the thoughts of Moses standing on that spot, looking down to the right, seeing all the people, looking across and seeing the Jordan River Valley, seeing the promised land. He had brought them this far. He had led them through all kinds of stuff. And he's standing on that mountain where I was standing in that moment taking a picture. And he was not able to actually go into the promised land. He wasn't able to lead them in. It said on a clear day you can actually see Jerusalem across. And this is the Sea of Galilee. So I got to actually walk through, see parts of the promised land. This is on the south side. Look all the way across there is Capernaum, where the fishers of men fished. When people talk about the promised land, there's this map, this place on the planet. And God strategically chose this little piece of dirt that's an intersection of all these it's a crossroads of civilization. They have to go right through the spot, right there where it says Fertile Crescent, right to the left. That's where the promised land is located. And in Ezekiel 5 it says, this is Jerusalem which I have set in the center of the nations with countries all around her. God strategically chose this piece of dirt because the gospel could be spread throughout the world from this place. The promised land. The first time the promised land is given or spoken of is to Abram. It's in Genesis 13. We read these words. The Lord said to Abram, look around from where you are, to the north and the south, from the east and the west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring. And then this word, forever. And there's still political implications about that little word, forever, of people who battle and wrestle with who owns this promised land, who has the right to worship and be in this holy promised land. He goes on to say, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. And God reiterated that promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. The land is a gift. Now, in Abraham's life, he only owned a little plot, but he had this hope that someday his descendants in the future would come back and own this land that God had promised them. So imagine years later, when the Israelites are getting ready to be rescued from slavery. A couple weeks ago, we had the story of the Passover. And they'd seen the 10 plagues, and Moses is doing crazy stuff, and God's going to come rescue them. They're supposed to have their coats on ready to go and leave slavery. And it says this, obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. Then, when you enter the land that the Lord will give you, as he promised, observe this ceremony. Imagine a group of slaves who have nothing and own nothing. They're going to go away with stuff, spoils from Egypt, and they have a land, they have this hope. There is a promise of a home, of a land that will be their own. Imagine that their dreams would come true with this promised land. So just what is the promised land? A couple definitions. First one is, it's this geographical location. It's the dirt. It's the land you can go visit, the land of Israel. It's the promised land. But second, when we think about promised land, it's a term that we use for, quote, any type of satisfying achievement or a state of realized dreams, unquote. So Super Bowl Sunday, only one team will reach the promised land. Christians refer to the Holy Land, the promised land, as heaven. That heaven is the promised land. But the promised land is also, throughout this understanding, a theological concept referring to this state of holiness where we are at rest in a relationship with God. That the promised land is a state of holiness where we are at rest in a relationship with God. And in both the Old and the New Testament, God promises to bless his faithful followers and give them a restful place, a place of peace and safety where they'll be free from foreign attack and freedom from enemies, a holy place where they will be at peace with God. So, are you there yet? This holy place at peace with God? Has God given you this gift, this place in the promised land? The answer is yes. But sin just finds a way to sort of fuzzy it up and make it not so clear. Distorts our view of the promised land being present. Let me see if I can explain. How many of you could say this morning, I've arrived? One. Great. Okay. And some people would say they arrive when they graduate from high school. I've arrived. Some people, they say they've arrived when they're 21, they can drink legally. I've arrived. Some people, it's when they get their first job. Some people have arrived when they get married or have children or buy their first house. For some people, they've arrived when they have a certain amount of assets they set, sort of investments, and they feel safe. I've arrived. I'm thinking about retirement for the first time lately. Maybe when you retire, is that when you say, I've arrived, I made it to retirement? Doesn't feel much like the promised land to me today. Because it feels like there's always something that gets in the way. No matter how hard we try or how hard we work, we're never going to quite get there to the promised land. Because life is hard. And pain and suffering somehow find a way to inevitably jump their way in. And we all know that. We've experienced that in life. So imagine the Israelites. They had all been from Egypt through the desert to Mount Sinai, and traveling from Mount Sinai, they finally get to the promised land, and they finally arrive there. They can see it across the valley. Remember the story of the 12 tribes? 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. What did they see when they spied on Canaan? 10 were bad and 2 were good. Some saw giants big and tall. Some saw grapes in clusters fall. Some saw God was in it all. 10 were bad and 2 were good. Didn't you learn this in Sunday school? Well, I did. There were 12 spies. 10 of them were good. 2 of them were bad. They're divided. And they both went to see the promised land. And they had 2 very different reactions, different views, depending on what they focused on. 10 only focused on the problems. And they forgot all that God had done to bring them this far. Doesn't that sound familiar? Why is it that just like the Israelites, when we are faced with challenges and hardships, we're quick to doubt that God's going to show up? I mean, I believe that God keeps his promises. I believe that Jesus is my Savior. I believe my sins are forgiven. I believe in Easter. But somehow, I don't believe God's going to show up when I really need him to. What is that? Because in Numbers 13, Caleb, one of the 2, Caleb and Joshua are on the 2, Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we certainly can do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack these people. They're stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. And this phrase, "We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. We're just a bunch of bugs." You ever feel like that? Like I'm just a grasshopper? I'm just a bug? Ever feel afraid like that? Like there's no way I can do this? I don't have the strength. I don't have the stamina. I don't have the ability to actually accomplish this. I remember when our consultants came and talked to us about our last capital campaign, they said maybe $2 million, $2.5 million at the most, and we said we had to raise $4 million. And in 5 years, we paid off more than $4 million in the middle of a pandemic. That somehow when God shows up and moves, things happen beyond what we can dream or imagine when we're afraid and think, it's not possible, can't do it, can't be done. We say, maybe God will show up again and lead us to that place. There are times when the good life, or I've arrived, seems unattainable, like I'll never get to the promised land. And I feel like I'm always falling short, I'm always coming short. And there's this simple truth. We can only see what we're focusing on. And that becomes all that we see. Find my spouse's faults, it's all that I can see. Challenges at the office at work becomes that's all that I can see. Realistic expectations, that's all I can see. Masks, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, it's all I can see. All I can see is the mistake that I made, and it's sort of haunting me. I can't seem to shake it from view. And I doubt and I wonder, will I ever be good enough? And that's all that I see. I'm falling behind. I can't keep up the pace. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Or my parents are going to be disappointed. The tangible disappointments and challenges that we face tend to overshadow our faith and our trust in God. And that old saying comes true. We miss the forest for the trees. Because even after all that they had been through and all that they had seen God do, 10 influenced them, grumbled against God, and grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And this is what they said. If only we had died in Egypt. Wouldn't it be better if we go back to Egypt? We should choose a new leader and go back. Seriously. We are a grumbling, mumbling, fumbling, stumbling lot, aren't we? So Joshua says, one of my favorite words, but God. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey. He will give it to us. And the book of Joshua recounts the story of how God literally gave them the land. The land was a gift. And God wants to give you the promised land. He wants you to have a place of rest where you can feel secure. He wants you to believe that He truly loves you. He wants you to trust in Him. He wants there to be a holy place where your relationship with Him can truly thrive. Are you there yet? As I listen, it's been hard lately. COVID's kind of worn us all out. We kind of feel the economic pressures and the job pressures and the tensions in relationships and corruption in the church and in politics is all made us kind of a little cynical. And life's pressures and sinful, self-absorbed people tend to just suck the joy out of life. And they make us anxious and restless and weary. Does your life feel more like you're in the promised land or more like you're wandering around in the wilderness these days? Do you sense God at work transforming your heart? Or like the Israelites, do you want to go back to being a slave? Slave to some old sin, slave to some unhealthy habit, slave to some painful relationship. Go back to living in some fear or back to living in shame or back to living life alone and being on your own. See, God's desire is not for us to continue to do laps in the wilderness. But in our sinfulness, we sure end up there a lot, don't we? I recently read this quote that resonated with me. It was titled, "I feel like I'm in transition." I'm uncomfortable with what was once comfortable and a bit tense about things didn't used to bother me. What used to be funny isn't as funny anymore. What I used to enjoy, I don't enjoy as much anymore. And what I used to be satisfied with, I'm not satisfied with anymore. All of a sudden, I don't fit in places where I used to fit in, and I don't understand what's going on, but I know I can't stay here. This is not the promised land. Promised land? You got to show me, because I'm not feeling it. In the book of Deuteronomy, it stresses again and again, God, His people, and the land, they belong together. And last we learned about this covenant at Mount Sinai, where there were promises that we make. It was a God will do, we will do back. There was a responsibility, a conversation, a covenant made. And God made it clear, as long as you worship the Lord, you would rest assured that you can live in the land in peace and safety. Enjoy the fruit of the land. On the other hand, idolatry would get you expelled from the land. So the rest of the Old Testament tells the story of how Israel proved faithless over and over again. In the beginning, when Joshua went in, they never actually took the whole promised land. They never made it a holy land. They left false gods and idols on top of hilltops all over the land. And they got caught up in the temptations and pressures of life around them. They got comfortable with the people of the land and their religious practices. And they ended up worshiping idols. And as a result, they rarely had peace. So are you missing the promised land because, like Israel, you keep making some sinful choice and worshiping some idol instead of worshiping God? God spoke to the prophet Jeremiah, I brought you into a plentiful land, but when you came in, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. The Old Testament thread of the story says that after lots of warnings and prophets speaking and telling them, they refused to listen. So finally, God allowed them to be expelled from the land. Literally, 10 northern tribes, and finally Babylon comes, takes them out, wipes down the city of Jerusalem, and takes them off into exile. 70 years later, they return. And they rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem, they rebuild the temple, but they never really took back the boundaries of the promised land. So when Jesus comes, this promised Savior King, the Messiah, where did He begin His ministry, remember? He goes to be baptized by John the Baptist on the other side of the Jordan, where He's staying there looking across the Jordan River to the promised land. And what Israel never did, they never went in and actually made it a holy land. Jesus said, I'm going to go into the promised land. I'm going to make a holy land. I'm going to make it holy. I'm going to forgive sin and declare this to be a holy place where God dwells. If you think about the story of Jesus, He never actually restored the land. In fact, He doesn't really talk about the land at all in the Gospels, at least not much. Why not? Because everything people were hoping to find in the land can be found in Jesus. Everything people were hoping to find in the land can be found in Jesus. So what? Where is this promised land today? Where is the place where God and His people live together in grace? The place where you can find other sinful, broken people who desperately want peace. Where is this holy place where God is present and real? From the north to the south, from the east to the west. You're sitting in it. This holy place on planet Earth. Now, the perfect promised land of heaven hasn't quite happened yet, but it's guaranteed to us who by faith in Jesus know, I will be in that place called heaven. And even though we're not yet there, it's not yet perfect, every day we get to live to bring this piece of heaven into our life, the promise of heaven, the promise of life, and sin being gone and death being destroyed. We get to live with that promise and bring that reality into every day. It's now we're in the promised land, but we're not yet perfect. The church isn't perfect now. But it's the best thing we've got. Because here, God is washing sins away in baptism. Here, the Holy Spirit is speaking the Word of God and speaking truth into our world. Here, Jesus is present in bread and wine and saying, I am here to forgive you and announce the grace of God personally given to you. And the holiness that Jesus won is shared and lived out here among us. Now, we're not perfect at it. And in fact, a lot of times we're just like the Israelites of old who never made it to the promised land, never made the promised land holy. And we grumble, we don't trust God, we follow our own way, but let's get at it. I think it's critical that the church survives and thrives. Do you see the thread? The thread of the promised land, this hope of a place where people and God can dwell in peace, this holy place. So we're going to go out in the crossing after church, and we'll put a piece of cloth onto the cross. And I'll remind ourselves that at the cross, Jesus said, I took your sin, I took the punishment. On the cross, that I am making you holy. I'm guaranteeing that there is a relationship between you and God. On the cross, says, I'm bringing the holy land, the holy presence of God, and I'm giving it to you. Jesus said, I'm delivering the holy presence of God, and you are living in it. I am living in you. So an article about the promised land by Stephanie Bryant, and she wrote this. Where is God calling you? The promised land is where heaven comes down to meet earth, where God comes to dwell in you and with you, where the reason you were created becomes clear. Israel never made it to the promised land. They got the dirt, but not the relationship with God. And the way the church looks sometimes, we haven't made it there either. And people have gotten cynical about the church, and that breaks God's heart, and it ought to break ours. So the question is simple. Are we there yet? Because it's harder than I thought. It really is. We are sinful just like the Israelites of old. But the story of Jesus is real. And we can be a part of changing the perception of church. Together we can work to create a place where God is at work, where people experience moments of this is the promised land. Moments when they feel loved and forgiven. Moments when they're surrounded by grace and restored. They have people that walk beside them through the tough stuff of life. This is the promised land. It won't be perfect until heaven comes. But here, wounded and hurting and broken people like you and me, who've been messed with by sin, can find hope and peace. Because Jesus is at work here. And grace and forgiveness reign here. And at our best, this is a little piece of heaven on earth. And we can follow the thread that gets us to Jesus, and we can keep our focus on Jesus and who He is and what He has done. And that can guarantee us a way of bringing ourselves into the promised land and bringing the relationship of Jesus into our life and creating the promised land wherever we are. We can love and forgive each other and give each other a glimpse of the promised land. Are we there yet? Yeah. But not quite fully. Not until heaven comes. So what if we get up every day and I keep my focus on Jesus and on the fact that I am loved and forgiven by God? And I'm going to use whatever God has given me to make sure this place is the promised land. This is a place where people experience the grace and love and forgiveness of God. This is a place where I sing songs. This is the place where Jesus is present for me and in us and with us. And all of a sudden, the promised land is not some future dream. It becomes the reality of the way that we live in peace, in the presence of God, declared by God to be holy and forgiven. What if we said every day, I'm going to bring the promised land here? Amen?